Hello, I'm Helen Foray, and welcome to a special hour-long edition of Issues. For the first time in more than half a century, the United States reinstated formal diplomatic relations with Cuba. On Wednesday, President Barack Obama announced he is using executive action to increase business and travel to Cuba. In addition, remittances will be dramatically increased, and the use of debit and credit cards from U.S. banks on the island will be allowed. Additionally, the president is asking Secretary of State John Kerry to review the island's status as a terrorist state. By all accounts, it is a sweeping change in policy on the part of the United States. In return, Cuba commits to releasing 53 political prisoners and will allow the United Nations and the International Red Cross to return to the island. Included in the president's announcement was the news of the release of 3 Cuban spies to the island, and Cuba released Alan Gross, a U.S. aid worker who had been held for 5 years on the island, and a Cuban spy who was working for the United States and had been in jail on the island for 20 years. Local Cuban Americans are torn over this issue. Nationally, there is also great division. Joining me to discuss this historic policy change with Cuba is Congresswoman Ileana Ros Lehtinen, Republican representing District 27. Congresswoman, good to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
First of all, you have been in Congress for a long time. You've held important committees, including you were former chair of Hemispheric Foreign Relations for Congress. You've covered this issue, and for you personally, it has to have some impact. What are your immediate thoughts?
I'm aghast. I'm flabbergasted and just blown away at the breadth of these sweeping changes in exchange for nothing. I mean, even when you read the summary, and that's just a clear-cut summary of what the deal entails, we have given everything to Raul Castro, to this dictatorship. And what have we gotten in return? Nothing. Not even cosmetic changes, economic reform, political reform, human rights being respected, nothing. All that Raul has had to do was free people who should have never been in jail in the first place. 50-something odd human rights activists who should never have been in jail. It's like you jail all the people, and then every dictator knows, you want to get a deal with the United States, just do all the bad things, and you will get everything in return. This president has a checklist of countries and deals that he wants to make. It doesn't matter. He doesn't negotiate. It's not that he's a bad negotiator. He doesn't negotiate at all. Cuba, check. Iran, check. North Korea, who knows? Check. Israel next, check. You don't know what you're going to get in return. Raul has won this debate, has won this round, and it's to the detriment of human rights, freedom, and democracy in Cuba, because none of these changes that the United States is making will make any changes in Cuba society.
But Congresswoman, you know that there's been a great debate as to what to do with the United States policy towards Cuba. The embargo, many would say, has been a total failure. Why not try something different?
I can understand people who say that, Helen, but it's not a reality that goes on in Cuba. Cuba has a society that's very similar to North Korea. You can't even compare it to Vietnam or to China. North Korea is the real model. In Cuba, one can't own property. You lift all these sanctions. Will you be able to own property? Will you be able to hire workers? Will you be able to, what's the structure now? If you're a French hotel, and you do business in Cuba, you don't own the hotel, you don't own the land, you don't even hire the workers. You pay the Cuban regime in dollars. The Cuban regime then pays that worker in undervalued pesos. So it's a slave economy. It's an exploitative society. And what are we getting in return? Well, all we did was send 3 convicted U.S. spies from Cuban spies in the U.S. back to Cuba. One of them, Gerardo Hernandez, it was responsible for the Brothers to the Rescue shoot-down that resulted in 3 American citizens and 1 U.S. resident dead over international airspace, and they were doing nothing wrong. For that, Cuba suffered no penalties. And also, for just this past summer, Cuba was smuggling arms through the Panama Canal on a North Korean frigate filled with MiGs and all kinds of warfare goods, munitions, etc., in violation of international sanctions. Cuba paid no price for it. It's like we're willing to look the other way, and this deal is such a bad deal for freedom and democracy in Cuba. If I could see that there's a path toward democracy, then I would say, well, I could see trying that point of view. But lifting sanctions now without any changes in Cuba takes away the leverage that we were going to have once that society started to change.
But when was that society going to change?
Well, that's why the United States needed to have an active campaign with all of our partners, and they are partners who want to see us really help the civil society. The Obama administration was not even willing to tell our U.S. interest section in Cuba, hey, invite all the dissidents, like every day, every week, have that embassy, mini embassy, the consulate, be the oasis of democracy on the island of Cuba. Not even that. We have always been acquiescing to Raul Castro's dictatorship. So you're right. Under this administration, I don't see how that space for civil society could ever have been created. This administration has been unwilling to do that, and they're always willing to do bad deals with every dictator. We're about to sign a nuclear arms deal with Iran that will let them enrich centrifuges and let them enrich uranium.
You're saying that the Obama administration, if I get you correctly, what you're saying is that the Obama administration has a checklist of do a deal with a number of countries, regardless of what the implications are and the seriousness to protect U.S. national security.
I really do believe that. I believe that the Obama administration has a checklist. He wants to earn the Nobel Peace Prize that he got prematurely, and before his term expires, he's going to check off all of these countries that have heretofore been enemies of the United States, and he wants to pretend that they're our friends without making them change anything about their structure. In Iran, the human rights violations are atrocious. The centrifuges are spinning, yet we're going to sign this deal in the beginning of summer. In Cuba, nothing has been changed. For that peaceful advocate for freedom, he got up this morning and his life has not changed. They're not going to beat the ladies in white right away, because people are watching and people are looking.
Well, they just did it on International Human Rights Day just a couple of weeks ago.
More than 100 arrests, 240 arrests. That is how Cuba celebrated International Human Rights Day 2 weeks ago, in the midst of them doing this wheeling and dealing with the Obama administration. And when Raul Castro announces the deal to the Cuban people on state-run media, what does he wear? The guayabera he usually wears? No, he puts on his military green fatigues. I think that's very telling. And he said to the Cuban people, we did not have to make any changes. We did not have to appease this, what has heretofore been their monster, the evil Yankee imperialist. And in fact, the Obama administration, with their changes, what they're saying is, hey, Cuba's for sale. The Cuban Revolution was founded on this was going to be equality for everybody. We're going to get all these Yankees out of here. We're going to be the ones who own Cuba. And now the Obama administration is saying, hey, come to Cuba, get a good deal, and everything's up for grabs. And for Raul, it's throwing him a economic lifeline. Their benefactor, Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, doesn't have the financial wherewithal with the collapse of the oil money, so he's desperately reaching out, and Uncle Sam is helping him out. I would have never thought that this would be, that I would be here when we would be establishing, normalizing relations with Cuba, with no changes being required of Cuban society.
What are the changes that minimally do you think should have been included if the United States was going to make this move?
And I think those changes are well articulated by the human rights activists that we have seen quoted. Even those who are for some of the changes have still been in favor of keeping the embargo and keeping these restrictions on until you have what our bills call for, what our laws say. Not that the president pays much attention to the laws, but it says diplomatic relations will be established once you have freedom for all political prisoners. Not these. You can't jail them and then free them and say that you've complied with that requirement. Freedom for all political prisoners, establishment of elections, political parties, free expression of ideas, free press. It's been codified into law thanks to Lincoln Diaz-Balart, but none of those have been complied with. I believe that the president is acting in a non-legal way. I believe it's in violation of 3 of our laws. And I also... Helms-Burton, the Cuban Solidarity Act, and the Trading with the Enemy Act. I believe that we've been looking the other way every time Cuba has violated norms, like Brothers to the Rescue shoot-down, like the North Korea ship that I talked about, the legal transfer of arms. We have been wanting to look the other way because the administration wants to set this historical precedent, live up to a legacy that people have seen in him that he has not really lived up to. So these last 2 years are going to be very dangerous for our allies. They're going to be terrific years for our enemies. I worry about the implications for Israel. I believe that the administration is going to get really tough with Netanyahu or whoever the prime minister is. It's not about personalities, and going to force them to do a deal with the Palestinians. Heck, they were even thinking about sanctioning Israel over settlements, yet overlooking that Israel is under attack by Hamas all the time. And I worry about the nuclear deal with Iran. This administration has a checklist of countries. They will check them off and not worry about the fine print and not worry about what we get in return. What did Cuba learn from this lesson? Hey, jail an innocent aid worker, Alan Gross, for 5 years. And what do you get in return? You get normalized relations and a U.S. embassy. That is a great lesson for all the dictators around the world to understand.
Congresswoman, within the Cuban-American community or the Cuban community, this has been a very divisive issue. There are those who would say that the community is split almost 50-50 regarding this issue. And if you look at Miami International Airport just this coming weekend, there are almost 50 flights Saturday and Sunday, absolutely full, traveling to Cuba. What does that tell you?
What it tells me is that the Cuban dictatorship has divided Cuban families, and the love of family is so strong. People want to see their families. We understand family travel. What we don't understand is making concessions to an evil dictator who celebrated Human Rights Day by jailing people, giving him everything. Yes, family travel, we understand. But who is responsible for dividing the Cuban family? Is it U.S. policy? No, it's the Raul Castro regime and Fidel. That regime, whether it's Fidel, whether it's Raul, or a young Marxist who will then take their spot. Remember, this was revolution founded on equality for all. And now Raul is saying, hey, come on over, do business with us. The Yankees that we kicked out 50-something years ago, we want them to come back in because we have no cash. It is a heartbreak for Cuban families, but I would say that all of us want freedom, democracy, human rights restored. We disagree on how to get there, but the other side that wants to get there at any cost, wheeling and dealing on the backs of the misery of the Cuban people, that is exploiting our misery. And I think that's sad and pathetic.
How do you walk this back, assuming you can? Senator Marco Rubio has said that in his position as chair of the subcommittee of Western Hemispheric Affairs in the Senate, that he's going to do everything in his power to stop the financing of an embassy, allowing, approving an ambassador, a Cuban ambassador to the United States. Just realistically, how much can a Republican House and Senate walk this back?
Well, I hope that we can do a lot. I congratulate Marco, who's been such an articulate a leader and a spokesman for the anguish of the Cuban exile community. I congratulate Bob Menendez, former chairman, well, still chairman today, of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who has been such a strong voice, Democrat from New Jersey. This is a bipartisan issue, and we're united, and we have the votes to maintain this tough line on the dictatorship and to help civil society in Cuba, because we are about helping the civil society as well.
Then you have a Republican Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona, who has been a big part of this negotiation. As much as you have bipartisan support against this initiative. You have a lot and maybe even stronger bipartisan support in favor because there are a lot of states that want trade.
I know. They see that. You're so right, Helen, in the way that you say that. They see Cuba as a new market, as where can I make some more dollars. I love our capitalist system, so I celebrate people wanting to make money, but I think that the United States is even greater than that. I think that we stand for values and we stand for principles, and we want people to be free, and we understand the conditions have to be right for that to happen. So I hope that we get the support in Congress to stop the building of the embassy. This is just moving way too fast without demanding anything of the Cuban regime. We have been down this road before. In the Black Spring, 75 dissidents were jailed in Cuba. Reforms were going to take place. And then when the press wasn't looking, we were back to the same thing. Is Raul Castro really going to be willing to let go of the total control that he has on the island? And this telecommunications strategy of the president, remember, that is what got Alan Gross in jail in the first place. It wasn't U.S. It wasn't the U.S. that jailed him. It was the Cuban regime that jailed him for doing exactly what President Obama says he wants to do in Cuba. So we need to see what is behind all of this. This has been a very well-orchestrated campaign. Now they're giving credit to the New York Times, Ernesto Londoño, who's been very obsessive about writing editorials.
He's a member of the editorial board.
Now he wants to be thought of as the director of that. Or our editorials caused all of these changes to take place by the Obama administration. Please, he's a guy who was used by the administration. They formulated this policy. They set this out. They said, who can we get?
He's actually been traveling to Cuba.
Oh,
with some
absolutely. Of course, he has been used by the administration to lay this out.
I don't know that he's used. I think he's
he thinks that he's the director of the band, but he doesn't know.
He agrees with the policy. The Catholic Church's involvement has been in this regard prior to Pope Francis. This has been going on since Pope Benedict XVI.
Well, give as the Bible says, give to Caesar what is Caesar, to God's what is God's. The church has had an interest in making sure that we can all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. That's wonderful. I agree with the Pope. We should all do that. And the Pope is not in the business of doing deals with governments. They want everyone to have freedom to worship, etc. I congratulate the Pope for everything he does everywhere. But he is not in charge of U.S. national security. The Pope is not in that. That's not his business. And I believe that this deal is dangerous for U.S. national security. I believe that we've given Raul Castro these 3 convicted spies, and now they've made up this Cuban James Bond figure who was, without his help, we couldn't have put Ana Belén Montes in jail and Ken Myers in jail. It's this mystery figure whose name has already been revealed, where I have talked to the people who laid the case out for both Ken Myers and Ana Belén Montes, and they say there was this person was not the pivotal James Bond that the administration makes it out to be. This deal is bad for U.S. national security. The Pope is a wonderful man of peace. He is not in charge of U.S. national security. That is not his priority. It should be the president's.
Congresswoman, economically, isn't this good for South Florida?
You know, you can wheel and deal with everyone, and it's always good for business. You can prop up regimes with your economic power. I understand our capitalist way of thinking, but I come from it from a human rights point of view, and I believe that what is good, that old saying from the former president, what's good for America, but what's good for business is good for America. That's not true anymore. And I don't think that we should let the U.S. Chamber of Commerce lead our foreign policy initiatives. And I don't think that we should let the Catholic Church lead our negotiations with evil dictators. They all have a place. Good for the U.S. Chamber to do their business. Good for the Pope to look for peace and humanity, especially in this holiday season. I congratulate them all. But the president should be on the lookout for the national security of the United States. That should be his priority, not making deals and getting a legacy that he wants to be thought of as a legend. I worry about what will happen in Cuba. I worry that the human rights leaders are marginalized, and now people are going for the fast buck. Hey, let's make money off of the Cuban misery. Nothing has changed in Cuba today, 3 days after, 4 days, 6 days after the announcement. those human rights activists are no safer, no freer. Human rights are no more respected than they were before. Nada has changed.
Congresswoman Ileana Ros Lehtinen, thanks so much for joining me today.
I hope we have better news soon.
On the island for 20 years. Local Cuban Americans are torn over this issue. Nationally, there is also great division. Joining me to discuss this historic policy change with Cuba is Congresswoman Ileana Ros Lehtinen, Republican representing District 27. Congresswoman, good to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
First of all, you have been in Congress for a long time. You've held important committees, including you were former chair of Hemispheric Foreign Relations for Congress. You've covered this issue, and for you personally, it has to have some impact. What are your immediate thoughts?
I'm aghast. I'm flabbergasted and just blown away at the breadth of these sweeping changes in exchange for nothing. I mean, even when you read the summary, and that's just a clear-cut summary of what the deal entails, we have given everything to Raul Castro, to this dictatorship. And what have we gotten in return? Nothing. Not even cosmetic changes, economic reform, political reform, human rights being respected, nothing. All that Raul has had to do was free people who should have never been in jail in the first place. 50-something odd human rights activists who should never have been in jail. It's like you jail all the people, and then every dictator knows, you want to get a deal with the United States, just do all the bad things, and you will get everything in return. This president has a checklist of countries and deals that he wants to make. It doesn't matter. He doesn't negotiate. It's not that he's a bad negotiator. He doesn't negotiate at all. Cuba, check. Iran, check.
Hello, I'm Helen Foray, and welcome to a special hour-long edition of Issues. For the first time in more than half a century, the United States reinstated formal diplomatic relations with Cuba. On Wednesday, President Barack Obama announced he is using executive action to increase business and travel to Cuba. In addition, remittances will be dramatically increased, and the use of debit and credit cards from U.S. banks on the island will be allowed. Additionally, the president is asking Secretary of State John Kerry to review the island's status as a terrorist state. By all accounts, it is a sweeping change in policy on the part of the United States. In return, Cuba commits to releasing 53 political prisoners and will allow the United Nations and the International Red Cross to return to the island. Included in the president's announcement was the news of the release of 3 Cuban spies to the island, and Cuba released Alan Gross, a U.S. aid worker who had been held for 5 years on the island, and a Cuban spy who was working for the United States and had been in jail